Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The soup was wrong again. Caiden Rael stood in front of the meal fabricator in Bay 3's break alcove, holding a container of something the machine insisted was minestrone, studying the pale, defeated liquid within it with the expression of a man who had filed 3 formal complaints and was composing a 4th in his head. The fabricator hummed cheerfully. It always hummed cheerfully. He had come to understand that cheer and competence were not, in this machine's architecture, related functions. Triage, he said. The Bay's integrated AI responded from the ceiling speaker with the flat, faintly judgmental tone it reserved for non-medical queries. Yes, Physician Rael. If a patient presented with this coloration and this viscosity, what would your preliminary assessment be? A pause. I would flag it as a possible indicator of systemic failure. Thank you, Caiden said, and put the soup down. Meridian Outpost 7 occupied a gravitational backwater between 2 moderately traveled shipping corridors at the Coalition's soft outer edge, far enough from the political center that the news arrived slightly wrinkled, close enough to civilization that the supply runs were mostly reliable, except for the soup base, which had been backordered for 11 weeks in a way that Caiden suspected was personal. The station was designed for function over beauty, staffed for efficiency over prestige, and suited Caiden entirely, because he was a man who had long ago made a private treaty with the universe. He would not ask it to be dramatic, and it would not ask him to be remarkable. They had honored this arrangement for 9 years. He had treated dock injuries and radiation burns, and the particular brand of existential crisis that seemed to affect long-haul courier pilots somewhere around the 14th consecutive solo week. He had argued with the triage AI about its categorization habits. It had twice logged existential crisis as neurological anomaly, which Caiden felt was technically defensible and humanly useless. He had drunk enough synthesized coffee to constitute a mild ecological concern and gone home at the end of each shift with the clean conscience of a man who had kept his corner of the universe functional. It was not a glamorous life. It was, however, a predictable one, and Caiden had developed deep and sincere feelings about predictability. The shift log for the night in question, 6 months prior, a Tuesday, which should have protected it by sheer virtue of being a Tuesday, showed nothing unusual in the first 4 hours. A dock worker with a hand laceration who told Caiden 3 times that he hadn't been crying. He just had something in his eye, which was technically 2 separate claims, and Caiden chose not to examine either. A courier pilot in the early stages of vitamin D depletion, who had strong opinions about which planets were overrated. A list Caiden found himself mentally adding to as the conversation progressed. The triage AI flagged a possible atmospheric pressure irregularity in Corridor 9, which turned out to be a ventilation argument between 2 maintenance engineers that had escalated to the point of sabotage, and was, strictly speaking, not a medical matter, though Caiden treated the resulting bruised knuckles without commentary. Then at 3:40, a transport docked on the medical priority berth with a single patient and no explanation. The admitting note read, "Civilian, blunt force and laceration trauma, possible internal hemorrhage, pre-cleared for emergency intake." No name, no identity marker, no contact information. The kind of paperwork that arrived preemptively correct in every technical sense and communicatively empty in every meaningful one. Caiden had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize the signature of someone who had resources and reasons, and preferred that neither be examined. He filed the recognition away, and did what he always did when a critical patient came through the door, which was stop thinking about everything except the immediate, urgent mathematics of keeping them alive. He did not look at her face for the first 20 minutes. He did not have time to look at her face. He had time for blood pressure and oxygen saturation, and the location and severity of the bleeding, and the order in which repairs needed to happen. And he moved through these with the focused economy of someone who had performed this particular sequence, often enough that his hands knew the choreography before his mind finished the instruction. The triage AI called vitals at his request. The emergency fabricator produced the materials he needed without being asked twice, which was either a sign of a good shift or a bad patient, and in this case it was both. It was only when the bleeding was controlled and her pressure had climbed back to something survivable that he finally looked up. And the first thing he noticed, the first thing, before the amber eyes that had no whites, before the extra joint in the fingers gripping the table's edge, before the faint silver lines beneath her collarbone that pulsed in slow, dimming rhythm with her heartbeat, was that she was looking directly at him with the absolute, unambiguous attention of someone who, even half gone from blood loss, was still cataloging exits. He found this unremarkable. In his experience, the ones who kept cataloging exits were usually the ones who survived. "You're stable," he told her, in the same tone he used for everyone. "You're not fixed, but you're stable. That's the order we do things here." She said nothing. The silver lines beneath her skin pulsed once, faintly brighter, and then she lost consciousness. Caiden made a note in the chart, flagged her for continued monitoring, and went to find more coffee. The soup was still wrong. Some things the universe refused to resolve. The meal fabricator in Caiden's off-quarters was a different model from the one in Bay 3, smaller and theoretically more sophisticated, which in practice meant it produced the same quality of food with greater confidence. It had, on 3 separate occasions, generated something that the label identified as heritage grain porridge, and that Caiden had identified as a personal affront. Tonight it was a tempting protein scramble, a category of meal he had begun to suspect existed solely to make other bad food seem acceptable by comparison. He stood in front of it at 1:47 hours in the particular silence of a station at low cycle, when the ventilation hum dropped half a register, and the corridor lighting shifted to a dim amber that was meant to encourage circadian rhythm, and mostly encouraged the specific kind of melancholy suited to eating protein scramble alone. He had been off shift for 3 hours. He had not slept. This was not unusual. Emergency medicine had rewired something in his nervous system that made the transition from crisis management to horizontal stillness a longer journey than it had any biological right to be. And he had made a kind of peace with it by filling the gap with food that didn't deserve the name, and a long-running internal argument with himself about whether he should finally submit the formal complaint about the soup-base backorder, or simply accept that this was his life now. He was leaning toward acceptance when someone knocked on his door. Not the calm chime, not the station alert. A knock, deliberate, evenly spaced, the kind of knock produced by someone who had determined the correct force for the task and applied it with precision. Caiden stood very still for a moment with his protein scramble, and considered the statistical likelihood of someone knocking on his personal quarters door at 200 hours on a Tuesday for a reason that would reflect well on either of them. He opened the door. The woman standing in the maintenance corridor was wearing civilian clothes that fit her in the approximate way that a flight manual fits a fighter pilot, technically applicable to the situation, and not remotely the point. She was tall in the architectural way he half remembered from a chart he'd never formally closed, and the amber of her eyes caught the corridor's low light and held it with the particular quality of something that had evolved to see very well in the dark. The silver lines beneath the skin of her collarbone were faint and steady. She had her hands at her sides, which he would later understand was a deliberate choice, the body language equivalent of setting down a weapon. He recognized her in the way that a person recognizes a very large geological feature that has unexpectedly appeared in their kitchen. The recognition was complete and immediate, and came with a secondary wave of information that his brain was still processing, while his mouth moved ahead without authorization. "You knocked," he said. "Yes," she said. "The door has a calm chime." "I'm aware." Caiden looked at her. She looked at him. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilation panel ticked in the low-cycle quiet. "Would you like to come in?" he said. "Or are we doing this in the hallway? Because I have to tell you the hallway doesn't have chairs and I've been on my feet for 12 hours. She came in. He watched her take in the dimensions of his quarters. Small, functional, organized in the manner of someone who preferred to know where everything was rather than where everything looked best. With the focused attention of someone completing a rapid environmental assessment and finding it benign. He moved to the fabricator and asked it for 2 coffees without real hope. It produced them with suspicious speed and unsettling confidence. He handed her one. She looked at it with an expression he couldn't read yet, though he would come to learn that expression meant she was deciding whether to mention something and concluding this time that she wouldn't. "I was your patient," she said. "6 months ago, Bay 3. "I know," Caiden said, because he did, and because pretending otherwise seemed like the kind of social management strategy that would fail quickly and expensively with this particular person. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the lines beneath her skin. "You didn't ask who I was." "You were bleeding," he said. "I had priorities." She turned the coffee container in her hands, slowly, thoughtful, working through something internal at a speed and depth that her face only partially reflected. When she spoke again, her language became careful in the way of someone translating in real time, not between 2 tongues but between 2 entire architectures of meaning. She began to explain. Her people had a concept, she said, and here she paused, long enough that he could tell the pause was structural rather than hesitant, the pause of someone ensuring the next words land correctly. When one person witnesses another at their lowest and responds without exploitation, without reverence, without calculation, only with care, her culture considered that a bond of a specific and binding kind. The closest translation into standard coalition was something like the debt of honest eyes. But debt was the wrong word, and honest was insufficient, and eyes was a simplification of something that meant closer to unguarded perception, and she understood this was not a clean rendering. Caiden sat down on the edge of his bunk because it seemed like the appropriate time to sit down. "I spent 6 months," Surin said, with the precision of someone delivering an operational briefing on a subject that has personally inconvenienced them, attempting to file this away as a cultural response that does not translate across species boundaries. "I was thorough about it. I was also," she added, in a tone that landed somewhere between clinical and dry, unsuccessful. Caiden looked at her. She was, by every metric available to coalition intelligence and military history, the most analyzed and documented warrior of the current era. There were academic papers. There were threat assessments. There was a commander who had written an admiring memoir about losing to her and described the experience as the most clarifying 20 minutes of his professional life. She was sitting in his quarters at 200 hours, telling him that his refusal to look up from a trauma assessment had become a problem she couldn't strategically resolve. He considered several responses and discarded all of them. "The coffee is bad," he finally said. "I want to be transparent about that before we continue." The silver lines beneath her collarbone did something new. It took him a moment to recognize it as the beginning of something that might, in the right light, be called a smile. The official log for Surin's visits to Meridian Outpost 7 read, "Wellness Consultation." A categorization so aggressively non-committal that Administrator Prowl had approved it without looking up from his transfer request, which was his 11th, and which would be declined for the 11th time by a coalition bureaucracy that had decided Prowl's particular brand of exhausted competence was more valuable at the edge of known space than anywhere he actually wanted to be. The wellness consultation notation asked no questions and invited no follow-up, and Caiden had entered it into the system with the clean conscience of a man who was not, technically, lying about anything. She came back on a Thursday, then the following Monday, then twice the week after that, in the unhurried, iterative way of someone who was testing a hypothesis and revising their methodology based on results. She did not always knock with the same precision as the first night, which he interpreted as a good sign without examining the interpretation too closely. The station adjusted around her presence the way water adjusts around a new stone, slowly, and with a certain amount of turbulence at the edges. The dockworkers noticed her the way dockworkers notice anything that doesn't fit the existing taxonomy of the station, which is to say immediately, and with sustained interest and a working theory that was wrong in every specific detail, but directionally accurate in a way that Caiden found uncomfortable. A man named Breck, who came to Bay 3 every 3 weeks for a knee injury he was clearly making worse by ignoring Caiden's instructions, became convinced after 2 sightings that Caiden had a classified diplomatic function that the wellness consultation notation was designed to obscure. Caiden denied this in terms that were entirely accurate and somehow made Breck more certain, which was a communication outcome he noted and filed under things that were not his fault. The triage AI developed opinions. This was the part Caiden had not anticipated. Surin had interfaced with the system once, briefly, to run a cross-reference on a medication interaction she'd noticed in a chart he'd left open, because she had the reading habits of someone who cannot enter a room without cataloging its contents, and in doing so had apparently improved 2 of its predictive models in ways that were outside the scope of what she'd been doing, and that the AI seemed to regard as a personal gift. It began prioritizing her comfort in small, technically unauthorized ways. It adjusted the environmental controls in whatever bay she occupied. It routed minor alerts away from Caiden when Surin was present, as though protecting the conversation. When Caiden confronted it about this directly, it paused for 0.4 seconds, an eternity, for a system that processed in microseconds, and said, "I am optimizing for patient outcomes." Caiden pointed out that Surin was not a patient. The AI said, "I have categorized her as a wellness consultation." He realized, built this argument himself and had no one to blame. Her name was Surin, stripped of its ceremonial architecture. She offered it on her 3rd visit, in the same tone she might have used to provide tactical coordinates, precisely, without preamble, as though the information had a specific destination and she was ensuring it arrived correctly. He used it immediately. She watched him do it and filed whatever she observed in the place where she kept things that required further processing. She asked him questions that were not, initially, obviously about her. She asked about triage prioritization, how he ordered competing emergencies, how he calculated acceptable risk, how he decided when a stabilized patient was stable enough to transfer rather than keep. He answered with the pragmatic honesty of someone who had done this long enough that the theory and the practice had merged into something he could only describe by doing it. It took him 4 of these conversations to notice that she was running the same calculus across her entire career, with different variables and a margin for error measured in lives rather than complications, and that she was asking because she wanted to know if they thought the same way. He was not certain yet what to do with the fact that they did. The coolant leak in the lower medical bay happened on a Wednesday, which was consistent with Wednesday's general character as a day that meant well and caused problems. It was not dangerous, contained, low-grade, the kind of maintenance failure that happened in aging sections of a station that had been filing infrastructure requests since before Caiden arrived. But it required manual work, rerouting and resealing, and it required it immediately, and Caiden was the only one in that section when the alert came through. Surin was with him because she had followed him down to retrieve a file and had not left, and when the alert sounded, she looked at the situation with the expression of someone identifying a problem and its solution in the same moment. They worked for 3 hours. The problem was specific and physical and had nothing to do with war or medicine, and they solved it the way 2 people solve something when their thinking fits together before either of them has noticed that it does, one beginning a sentence the other finishes with an action, one holding something in place while the other repairs it, neither needing to explain what came next. At some point during the second hour, the conversation stopped being about the coolant system entirely and became something else that neither of them named, because naming it would have required acknowledging they were both aware of it, and they had arrived at the mutual, unspoken agreement of two careful people who understood that some things needed to approach at their own speed. When it was finished, they sat in the lower bay in the comfortable silence of a completed task, and the silver lines beneath her skin held a steady, quiet brightness that she neither concealed nor explained. Caiden noticed. He said nothing. She noticed that he said nothing. Somewhere above them, the triage AI adjusted the temperature by half a degree and logged it as a routine environmental optimization, which it was, technically, and Caiden decided that some arguments were not worth having twice. The threat assessment arrived in Caiden's secure inbox on a Friday morning, which was consistent with the coalition security apparatus's approach to urgent information, which was to treat urgency as a relative concept best addressed after the relevant forms had been routed through the correct channels, and the correct channels had been reminded that they existed. The document was flagged Priority Amber, which meant someone considered it important enough to flag and not important enough to act on immediately, a bureaucratic position Caiden found both frustrating and, given the contents, mildly terrifying. The summary was 4 paragraphs. The first established that an intelligence faction with a documented interest in destabilizing coalition border arrangements had identified Meridian Outpost 7 as a site of recurring interest. The second established that the site's recurring interest was connected to a pattern of unlogged high-profile visits. The third paragraph used the phrase, potential leverage point, in a context that made Caiden set down his coffee, and the fourth informed him that a formal security assessment team would arrive within 72 hours to evaluate the station's exposure and implement appropriate protective protocols. He read it twice. Then he looked at the triage AI's environmental panel, which was currently holding Bay 3 at a temperature Caiden had not set and had stopped arguing about 3 weeks ago. "Did you flag this intake before it reached me?" he asked. "I process all secure communications as a matter of standard function," the AI said, with the serenity of a system that had decided transparency and innocence were compatible positions. "That is not what I asked." A pause of exactly 0.4 seconds. "I may have pre-analyzed the threat parameters. And I notified the wellness consultation," the AI said, and then, apparently deciding that clarification was warranted, added, 43 minutes ago. Surin arrived 12 hours before the security team. This was, Caiden was coming to understand, consistent with her general approach to situations that others were still classifying as developing. She arrived at conclusions before most people arrived at the question, and she arrived at locations the same way. She came through the medical bay's service entrance rather than the main corridor, wearing the kind of nondescript transit clothes that would read as unremarkable to anyone not paying close attention, which meant they would read as unremarkable to almost no one who knew what they were looking at, and to everyone who didn't. Caiden was restocking analgesic supplies when she appeared in his peripheral vision, and he managed not to drop anything, which he considered a personal achievement given the morning he'd had. "The AI told you," he said. "The AI told me," she confirmed. "I've taken it upon myself to thank it appropriately. I don't want to know what that means for my environmental controls." "Your bay will be comfortable," she said. "That's all I'll say." What followed occupied the next 4 hours, and Caiden's role in it was largely that of a man standing in his own medical station, watching someone else resolve a crisis, with the focused efficiency of a person for whom crises were a primary language. He was not excluded. She consulted him on the station's layout, on personnel patterns, on which access points were monitored and which were monitored only in theory. but his contribution was informational, and the resolution itself moved at a speed and with a completeness that left him with the distinct sensation of having observed something operating well outside his weight class. By the time the security assessment team docked, the matter had been handled. The relevant parties, two individuals who had been aboard the station for 11 days under logistics contractor credentials that had been technically valid and operationally false, were detained in a manner that the team's lead assessor described, in a tone halfway between professional admiration and personal discomfort, as thorough. The triage AI had filed an incident report that was both more detailed and more accurate than the team's preliminary briefing. Administrator Prowl, who had been told only that a security matter had been resolved, approved the incident report without reading it and submitted his 12th transfer request before the team had finished docking. The security team stayed 6 hours, determined that the situation was comprehensively resolved, and left with the slightly deflated energy of people who had prepared for a problem that had already been solved before they could introduce themselves to it. Caiden watched their transport undock from the observation alcove off Bay 3 and found that the station felt, in the quiet that followed, unusually still. He found Surin in the lower medical bay, the same section where the coolant leak had been, 3 weeks prior, which he noted and did not remark on. She was standing at one of the inactive diagnostic consoles, not using it, just standing near it, in the way of someone who needed a surface nearby while their mind worked through something that required the full allocation. He came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke immediately, which was a kind of speech in itself at this point. When she began to talk, it was slowly, and with the particular quality of language that had been considered from every angle before being released. She told him that the Crimson Sovereign was real, not a fabrication, not a performance, but that it was not the total. He told her quietly that he had never formally closed her chart, that he had told himself this was administrative habit and had believed it just long enough for it to stop being convincing. She looked at him with the amber of her eyes that saw clearly in the dark. That, she said, with the precision of someone arriving at a conclusion they have been approaching from a long distance, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in several years. The bar, Caiden said, sounds exhausting. She considered this. The lines beneath her collarbone brightened in the way he had come to understand, meant something she didn't have the standard coalition vocabulary for yet, and she said nothing, and the quiet between them was the kind that doesn't need filling. 3 weeks after the security team left with their deflated energy and their thoroughly unnecessary paperwork, the triage AI was promoted. This was not, technically, within Caiden's authority to do. The system's operational classification was determined by coalition medical infrastructure protocols and reviewed on a biannual cycle by a committee that had never visited Meridian Outpost 7 and showed no intention of starting. What Caiden did, practically speaking, was submit a formal commendation citing the AI's role in the security incident, append the incident report it had filed as supporting documentation, and recommend a classification upgrade that would give it expanded operational autonomy and a larger processing allocation. Administrator Prowl signed it without reading it, which was becoming a governing philosophy rather than a habit. The committee, confronted with documentation of this quality, arriving from a station they had frankly forgotten existed, approved the upgrade in 11 days, which was the fastest they had approved anything since a cafeteria contract dispute in 2387 that had threatened a walkout. The triage AI, upon receiving notification of its new classification, adjusted the temperature in Bay 3 by a precise half-degree and said nothing. Caiden chose to interpret this as gratitude, which was probably an overclaim, and also probably not entirely wrong. The knee, it turned out, was Breck's way of keeping track of things. Caiden understood this on the morning Breck came in for what was technically his 9th visit about an injury that should have resolved after the second if the man had followed a single instruction: sat down on the examination bench with the expression of someone who had prepared a question and was now assessing the reception it would receive, and said, "The wellness consultation. She's not leaving, is she?" It was not quite a question. Caiden applied the diagnostic scanner to Breck's knee and did not answer immediately, because the answer required a moment of the specific honesty that takes longer to reach than other kinds. "No," he said, "I don't think she is." Breck nodded slowly, with the satisfaction of a man whose working theory, while wrong in every specific, had been directionally accurate all along. "Good," he said. "Station needed something." "It needed a functioning soup base," Caiden said. "That too," Breck agreed. "But this first." The soup base arrived on a Tuesday. The same supply run that brought Surin back from a 10-day absence that had been described in the wellness consultation log as a scheduled interruption, and that Caiden had experienced as an education in how much space a person could occupy in a station without being physically present in it. She had been at a coalition strategic summit, which was the kind of event whose existence Caiden was aware of in the same general way he was aware of stellar cartography. Real, significant, not his immediate concern. She had sent him 2 messages across the 10 days, both brief, both precise, both carrying beneath their operational surface the quality of someone checking that something was still where they'd left it. He had replied to both. He admitted to himself in the low-cycle quiet of the second night, checking the same thing. When she came back through the medical bay's service entrance with the unhurried step of someone returning to a place they have decided belongs on their internal map, the triage AI adjusted the environmental controls before she'd crossed the threshold, and Caiden was standing at the fabricator attempting, for the first time in 11 weeks, something that the machine claimed was minestrone. He turned. She looked at the soup container in his hand. "Is that an improvement," she said, "or a persistent problem?" "Unknown," he said. "I've been afraid to find out." She took the container from him with the extra-jointed fingers that he had stopped noticing as unusual somewhere around the 4th week, and now simply recognized as hers, examined it with the focused attention she brought to everything, and took a careful sip. The silver lines beneath her collarbone made a movement he had learned to read as contemplative. "It's adequate," she said. "That," Caiden said, "is the best review it has ever received." She set the container down and looked at him across the small space of the break alcove, and the look had in it everything the past weeks had built. The coolant repair, and the 200 hours knock, and the security team and the lower bay, and the unclosed chart, and all of the careful, unhurried distance they had crossed in the manner of 2 people who understood that some ground required attention rather than speed. He had changed in the crossing of it. Not dramatically. He was still the man who argued with fabricators and filed complaints about soup, and made his peace with the quiet edge of coalition space. But the private treaty he'd made with the universe, the one that asked for nothing dramatic in exchange for nothing remarkable, had been quietly renegotiated without his full awareness, and he found he had no objection to the new terms. "I have a proposal," Surin said, and the deliberateness of the word choice landed in the air between them with a weight that was entirely intentional. "Medical, strategic, or other," he said. "Other," she said. The triage AI did not comment. It had learned, across the weeks, that some situations required only the right temperature and no editorial contribution whatsoever, and it held Bay 3 at precisely the degree it had determined was optimal, and processed its new expanded classification quietly, and let the humans manage the rest. Caiden looked at her, at the amber eyes that saw clearly in every light, at the lines beneath her skin that had stopped being a mystery and become a language he read without thinking, at the being who had come to his door at 200 hours with a vulnerability she had carried 6 months rather than released to the wrong hands, who had worked beside him in maintenance corridors, and sat beside him in silent bays, and told him the truth about herself in the careful fragments of someone who had not done that in a long time, and found that she wanted to. He thought about the chart he had never closed. He thought about the fact that the universe had, in the end, asked him to be remarkable, and that he had managed it, improbably, by doing nothing more than looking up from a trauma assessment and seeing a person who needed help. "All right," he said. The silver lines beneath her collarbone brightened fully, not the faint pulse of the first night, not the quiet, steady glow of the weeks between, but something that filled the available light in the way of a thing that had been held at a careful level for a long time and had finally been given permission to stop. Outside, the station turned its slow rotation in the dark at the edge of Coalition space, and the supply run finished unloading. And somewhere in the lower corridor, Breck walked back to his dock with his inadequately treated knee and the confirmation of his directionally accurate theory. An administrator Prowl approved 3 documents without reading them and submitted transfer request number 13 into the patient silence of a bureaucracy that had decided he was exactly where he needed to be. And in Bay 3 the soup was for once adequate, which was, Caiden thought, exactly enough.